I must make an apology. I am not a French speaker. I hope you'll forgive me. And it's double jeopardy, I'm afraid, because although I will speak in English, I will do so with an Australian accent. And I do hope that you will not find that too difficult to bear. I've been asked by the organisers to give an overview of issues affecting economic development and to mention particular aspects to do with the Australian situation which the audience may find interesting. And I hope you do find some of the things I have to say of interest to you in Quebec. The effects of tourism. Tourism is regarded as an economic development lever, and of course they're the usual types of effects of tourism that are most talked about by researchers, consultants, and so on. However, the question is what measurement tools are most appropriate to assess tourism's economic significance? And my view is it's horses for courses. That is to say that the tools we use will depend on the context of inquiry. And I hope to give you a brief tour of some of the different measurement tools. 4 tools of analysis. I'm going to talk about tourism yield measures. I'll talk about the expenditure measures, which are popular but limited. I'm going to talk a little bit about tourism satellite accounts. I know that there will be other speakers talking about that, so I won't take too long on tourism satellite accounts. I'll also talk about economic impact analysis, which I have a particular interest in, and it's my view that often economic impact analysis is unfortunately not done very well internationally. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is the case. And I will conclude with a little bit on what's called cost-benefit analysis, which estimates the change in economic welfare from a policy or investment proposal. And this is quite different from economic impact analysis. Tourism yield, I'll start off talking about that. It's a standard measure. It's the amount of money that's injected into a destination by visitors. And this is often the basis of a destination marketing effort. All over the world, destination marketing organisations want high-yield tourists. And by that is often meant tourists who are big spenders. And this can guide destination stakeholders as to the origin markets that should be promoted and the types of products and services that should be developed to attract high-yield visitors. Well, so far, so good. And of course, measures such as this are important for determining the relative importance of both mature markets, that is, the major markets that already exist for a destination, and also emerging markets, markets of the future. And the Brazil, Russia, Brazil, Russia, China, and India, of course, the largest democracy in the world. Okay, that's a brain snap. In Australia, we have looked at expenditure measures and developed displays such as that, which give expenditure per night from different tourist markets. And that's information that has some significance. And we can determine the average expenditure from a representative tourist, and we can determine those markets that inject more per night or per trip and those that inject less than the average. We've also developed some displays such as that. The duration of stay, or the length of visit, is on the horizontal axis, and the expenditure per day is on the vertical axis. And we find it meaningful to be able to determine what quadrants origin countries fall into. And it seems to us that the most significant quadrant for destination marketing would be the northeast quadrant, the top one on the right. And in that particular display we have Hong Kong, Thailand, Korea, Indonesia and China. Now all of those markets have a higher expenditure per day together with a higher length of stay. So it seems to us that naturally enough, if that information were available, that the Destination Marketing Authority would want to target those types of markets. And all over the world, destination marketing authorities are doing something similar to that. However, expenditure measures have certain limitations. Gross expenditure, that's the amount of money spent by tourists, does not tell us in itself any information on what products tourists purchase. Give no indication of the business sectors that receive the sales revenues. One has to do more data analysis to determine that. Tourist expenditure is not an indicator of profitability. It's only one side of the equation, isn't it? Profits equals revenues minus costs. What about the cost side? What about the profits? It doesn't tell us anything about that. Gross tourist expenditure doesn't inform us about the import content of goods and services purchased by tourists. Leakages. Now, of course, import content depends on the jurisdiction. If I were looking at Canada, import content would be any goods that are sourced outside of Canada and the money flows out. But of course, if we're looking at the point of view of the province of Quebec, then any goods from British Columbia or Ontario would be imported. Gross tourist expenditure does not inform us about the contribution of expenditure to tourism output, tourism gross value added, tourism employment, and so on. And we need tourism satellite accounts for that. The expenditure measures ignore the economic impacts of tourist expenditure. They don't tell us the contribution of any increased tourism expenditure to gross domestic product, gross value added, employment, and so on. And for those purposes, we need an economic model, and I'll talk more about that. The expenditure measures don't tell us about the geographic spread of revenues. Do the revenues of tourists, are they focused more in Montreal or Quebec City, or are they more evenly dispersed around the province? That's an important issue, but expenditure measures per se do not inform us about that. And they don't tell us anything about the social or environmental costs and benefits associated with different visitor markets. So expenditure measures are useful only up to a point, and more analysis needs to be done if we're to make them more meaningful. Expenditure, of course, is important to small, medium enterprises. And around the world, the tourism industry is characterised by small to medium businesses. Of course, profits equal total revenue minus total cost, as I mentioned. Sales revenues are important to market shares, so businesses obviously need to be carefully monitoring their sales revenues. They're important to return on investment. Strong continuing tourism investment is vital to a successful tourism industry. Toward the end of my talk, I mentioned some of the issues we're confronting in Australia about tourism investment and the role of small businesses in that. Yield management, of course, is important to firms, price setting techniques to maximise revenues, where the price is varied according to the capacity to deliver and demand at a particular time. Now, the economic significance of tourism, there's an ongoing problem for policymakers as the lack of information concerning the economic significance of tourism. As you'd know, tourism is not a single industry in the national accounts, it's hidden in other sectors. If you look at the national accounts, you will not see tourism industry mentioned. You will see accommodation, you will see tours, you will see transportation and so on, shopping, etc., but you won't find tourism. And developing countries in particular have national statistics that are often of limited scope and doubtful accuracy. The result is there's a lack of appreciation of tourism's economic significance, and I think this is a worldwide lack of appreciation of the economic significance of tourism. What it does do, however, is often lead to dubious or exaggerated claims about tourism significance, such as tourism reduces poverty. I hear that a lot. Often that is a claim that there's not a lot of demonstrable evidence to support such claims. It depends on context, and I'm going to revisit that issue as well. Or the issue of tourism creates employment. Well, it may not. It may create employment in certain sectors, but it might lead to reduction in employment in other sectors. What is the net effect? Well, that needs to be determined. And often it's a poor basis for policy making because of the doubtful statistics. And I know that the Transat Chair is vitally interested in the types of statistics that can be generated to support views about the economic significance of tourism. Well, things have changed with the development of tourism satellite accounts. I have an overhead there that talks about the tourism satellite accounts, given that time is limited and that there will be more discussion of tourism satellite accounts. I won't linger long on that. But they are a set of accounts which enable us to determine the effect of expenditure on tourism, gross domestic product, gross regional product, employment, and so on. Now, the advantages of tourism satellite accounts, I might just mention those advantages. They help us to identify a tourism industry because there are definitions of what constitutes industries within the broader tourism industry. They do measure key economic aggregates associated with tourism, such as tourism GDP, tourism employment, and so on. They tell us about tourism's interrelationship with other industries because they tell us what industries provide inputs into the tourism industry. They support inter-industry comparisons. We can compare the contribution of tourism to gross domestic product compared to the contribution of the automobile industry or the contribution of mining and so on. So that's useful in that respect. They support international comparisons. We can talk about whether tourism provides or contributes more to GDP in Canada than it does in Australia or in another country and so on. And we can also say whether the accommodation sector in Canada contributes more to GDP than the accommodation sector contributes to GDP in, say, the USA and so on. And it gives credibility to estimates of the economic contribution of tourism. As I say, there will be more discussions about tourism satellite accounts, and they're increasingly providing a tool for research and policy analysis, as we'll see in the next couple of days. Now, I'm just giving you some examples of some of the displays that are interesting and emerge from tourism satellite accounts. Here we have selected tourism aggregates for Australia: internal tourism consumption, direct tourism output, net taxes and so on, and the tourism satellite accounts enable us to compare the situation for different time periods. So we're gaining a lot of knowledge that can be useful in determining trends and so on, and gaining an appreciation of the contribution of tourism to the economy. Here we have another type of display which maps out changes in tourism consumption, the aggregate, domestic tourism consumption and international tourism consumption, to be able to determine relative changes in these important aggregates. Some results from the Australian Tourism Satellite Account again. Here we have comparisons of changes in recent years of tourism GDP, tourism industry gross value added, tourism exports, domestic tourism consumption, tourism employed persons, and so on. So these are very useful tools to give us statistics, which then can be used for diagnostic purposes to determine strategies that can be enacted to remedy any deficiencies that are highlighted in terms of tourism's economic significance. Here we have, it's a funny looking diagram, but it's an interesting one, the growth in industry gross value added at current prices. Now, tourism is the bottom one, and the total economy is the top one. And what we find is that overall the percentage changes in the total economy have been more significant than the percentage changes in tourism, which again, to us in Australia, flags an important issue about why tourism has been performing relatively poorly compared to the total economy. And again, we can compare changes in important key sectors: accommodation, ownership of dwellings, travel agencies, tour operators, cultural services. Obviously, if you're in any particular sector there and you see that your sector is lagging behind where it was and so on, then that flags issues that need to be addressed. So what we have done, my researchers and I, have developed some yield measures using tourism satellite accounts, similar to the yield measures I talked about regarding expenditure. Now here's an example of total tourism gross value added per night. That's on the vertical axis. Tourism gross value added per night, an average length of stay. Here we have one country in that top quadrant, which is China. And that flags that China, the tourists from China, contribute more per night to tourism above average to tourism gross value added, and also stay an above average number of nights. And that makes China an important market for Australia. And we've developed displays such as that. Whereas if we looked at the left bottom, the southwest quadrant, we find that VFR, which is visiting friends and relatives, and the holiday market are below average, both in duration of stay and in terms of their contribution to gross value added. So that flags which markets ought to be targeted above others. And here we have gross operating surplus. And from an industry or sectoral point of view, this is a very important aggregate that emerges from tourism satellite accounts, because the gross operating surplus is a figure akin to profitability. And that type of information is very useful to individual firms. Tourism satellite accounts can be developed at regional levels, and I do understand there's going to be more talk about that as this conference proceeds. And I've asked the question, is there a tourism satellite account for Quebec? I looked at the information. I'm not sure that there is. Australia has tourism satellite accounts for all of the states and territories of Australia, 6 states and 2 territories. And I think we're the only country in the world that has a whole suite of tourism satellite accounts for this purpose. And the important thing about regional tourism satellite accounts is that it's often the case that since it's local authorities that are marketing tourism, developing tourism and so on, it's very important for them to have a state or province context rather than a national context. So I just flag that as something that I see as important. These are some displays we've developed for Australia. My team has developed these tourism satellite accounts for all states and territories in the nation. That's an example there, the Northern Territory. Displays like that tell us that for Australia as a whole, tourism contributes 3.5% to gross value added for the whole nation. But for the Northern Territory, it's much higher, it's 6.5%. So authorities in the Northern Territory look at such displays and understand the importance of tourism in their jurisdiction as compared to the nation. And so on. Here we have tourism in the Northern Territories contributes 14.2% of employment in the Northern Territory, as opposed to 5.6% of employment for Australia as a whole. Again, flagging the importance of tourism to that particular area. And here we have tourism industry output, and enables us to determine the relative contribution to output of different sectors within tourism. And this is important for policymakers to understand this. I think that those of you who are in industry often might lament or regret the fact that your sector doesn't seem to be as appreciated as well as it ought to be. Well, this type of information can help us to understand what are the different sectors that contribute to tourism output. And here we have the same type of information for tourism gross value added. tourism employment. Which are the sectors that employ people? Again, we've developed displays here based on the regional tourism satellite accounts. I mentioned that tourism in the Northern Territory contributes 14.2% of employment in that area, and of course then we can divide that up into the different sectors that employ people that are connected with tourism. And ministers of tourism always want to know, where does tourism fit? And in this display we find that if we were to construct a tourism industry without double counting things, we would find it would come in at 5th. My team did it for the state of New South Wales, and we met the Minister for Tourism, and we calculated that tourism came in at 11th. And she said, can't you get it into the top 10? You know, it would really help me in my getting money for tourism. But we pointed out that cricket teams have 11 players and soccer teams have 11 players, and 11 was quite respectable, so she bought that. And of course, net taxes. This is often a neglected area. Who pays the taxes? And the tourism satellite accounts enable us to determine that. Now, tourism satellite accounts measure the economic contribution of tourism, but they don't measure the indirect effects of tourism demand. They don't measure the economy-wide effects or impacts of shocks to tourism. They are just a snapshot. They represent a picture of an economy at a particular point in time. Unfortunately, they are often misused as economic impact tools. But they can't. They don't contain any behavioural equations telling us about the behaviour of firms, consumers, investors, government and so on. They don't take account of factor constraints. They don't tell us if there's a shock to tourism, how much prices will change or wages and so on. We need economic impact models for that. So I just mentioned that because, as I say, often people talk about tourism satellite accounts as an economic impact measure, and they are not. Economic contribution measures the size and overall significance of the industry within an economy. That's what tourism satellite accounts measure. Economic impact, however, refers to the changes in the economic contribution resulting from specific events or activity, comprising shocks to the system, whether those shocks are positive or negative. So this gives me an excuse to now briefly talk about economic impact analysis, the changes to an economy following a shock to tourism demand, whether it's a positive or negative shock. And economic impact analysis traces the flow of spending through the economy to determine the effect of this on such things as output, value added, employment, and so on. That's just a simple diagram there. We have on the left the tourism demand or supply shock, economic model, crank the handle, at the other end we get the economic impacts. And of course the standard view is that the spending has the shock. Let's assume it's a positive shock. We have direct spending, indirect spending, and induced spending. This is the well-known multiplier effect. And you'll find this discussed in every economics text, and almost every economic commentary talks about the multiplier effect of tourism expenditure. It's like a rock dropped into a pond and the ripples spread out, creating extra output, employment, value added, and so on. So that's the standard view. The standard view is that, well, it's based on certain assumptions, that there are no constraints on the economy's supply of land, labour and capital. Most multiplier analysis assume no constraints, certainly those that use input-output models. No changes in price and costs, no change in exchange rates. Resource costs are zero. There's no opportunity cost involved in using resources. Government fiscal policy is often forgotten or considered to be irrelevant, and the result is exaggerated multiplier effects. I wish I had $1 for every time I've read a commentary which really seriously exaggerates the economic impacts of tourism. I have a picture there. and it's the direct spending by tourists is the top of the outside in the open air, the tip of the iceberg, and then below that are these huge amount of indirect and induced effects brought about by the initial expenditure. That is the often, I think, captures people's views of the multiplier. However, in the real world, there are leakages. Products are imported due to domestic shortages. And often that's often a real serious issue for developing countries. You can't just say to a developing countries, oh, well, you must then meet tourist needs by local sourcing of products. Often developing countries simply cannot do this, and tourists often have tastes towards more imported products and so on, duty-free goods and so on. So there are leakages out of the system. Now that's fairly well known, and that's often admitted by proponents of the standard view of multiplier analysis. However, there are factor constraints. Economies experience an increase in tourism expenditure often face labour, land and capital constraints. Tourist expenditure will therefore, in those circumstances, result in increased prices rather than increased output, income or employment. Factor constraints lead to what we call interactive industry effects, which change the industrial composition of an economy. And I'm going to talk a little, I'll give you an example of a study that shows that. There can be a real exchange rate appreciation, especially with economies with flexible exchange rates and so on. If you have a shock to tourism, a positive shock, there is therefore an increased demand for the currency. That has some upward pressure on the exchange rate. And what do you think's affected? Standard exports and import competing industries are therefore impacted upon. Increased inbound tourism strengthens the exchange rate, leading to a reduction in other exports and or an increase in imports at the expense of the demand for domestic import competing commodities. Government fiscal policy might be expansionary or restrictive. Depending on the government's fiscal policy stance, the effects of tourism will differ considerably as to whether government facilitates it with increased investment and so on, or the government restricts the impacts, depending on its stance. Again, when I read the material for the background material here, I asked the question, does Quebec cross-sectoral model recognise these issues? And I don't know. I certainly hope it does. CG modelling is now the state-of-the-art type of models that are used to determine the economic impacts of tourism. We don't need to go into it in any depth. It's a set of equations which characterise the production, consumption, trade and government activities of the economy. These models can be quite complex. They treat the economy as a whole, allowing for feedback effects of one sector on another. The economy is a system of flows and goods and services between sectors. However, what they do recognise is that tourism growth may change more the composition of industry than its overall size. In other words, tourism might expand, but other industries might contract. The increased output of tourism may be more than offset by contractions in output elsewhere in the economy. There will be gainers and losers. And I'll mention some examples of these in a minute. They allow for the inclusion of constraints that are absent from the more simple input-output calculations. And the modelling shows that the effects of tourism growth cannot be anticipated a priori. So if you treat these models seriously, you cannot therefore claim that, oh, an increase in tourism will necessarily lead to an increase in employment or GDP throughout the economy. There will be sectors that contract in the economy. What the overall result is needs to be determined. And CG models are very useful for what-if scenarios in enabling policymakers to more clearly understand the economic effects of different changes which may affect the tourism industry. I'll talk about that. Here's some studies that have been done recently. Economic impacts of change in inbound tourism by origin market. We've done work ourselves looking at the impacts of tourism coming into Australia from different countries. For example, we're not getting as many Japanese tourists as we were before. The New South Wales government wanted to know what the effects on the economy were of the downturn in Japanese visitation. We put this through the model and we were able to determine what those impacts were. Different motivations. We can look at differences in VFR tourism or in business tourism or in holiday tourism and so on. Special interest tourism. We can look at convention visitors. We can look at more nature-loving tourists and so on, or sporting tourists for events and so on. The economic impacts of tourism crises, SARS, the global financial crisis, the Bali bombing, foot and mouth disease in the UK, all of these issues have been analysed using CG models. Economic impacts of special events, Olympic Games. There's been CG modelling of the Sydney Olympics and the London Olympics. Evaluation of economic policy. My team's done yield measures. We've estimated the return to marketing expenditure by simulating changes in the marketing activity and looking at what effect that has on different expenditure coming into the economy and looking at what the overall impacts on the economy are from that. Air services agreements, expanded air routes, globalisation policies, effects of taxes have been done, and does tourism reduce poverty? I mentioned this before, 2 studies that have been done using CG models, one for Brazil and one for Thailand, indicate that it's overly simplistic to say that tourism reduces poverty. For example, the Thai study showed that as more and more people come into Thailand, puts upward pressure on the baht. The agricultural sector of Thailand then starts to contract. Most people in Thailand are working in agriculture, therefore there will be a loss of employment in agriculture, which offsets any increase in employment in tourism. So I think you see what I'm getting at there. So there's a lot of work now being done on computable general equilibrium models. I'll give you an example that I like a lot. And this was, suppose we have 10% more tourists coming into Australia and they are allocated across Australia according to existing market shares. So New South Wales gets whatever percentage of those people that it was getting before. Queensland gets the same percentage that it was getting before. Victoria gets the same percentage it was getting before. So there's a 10% increase nationally allocated according to existing market shares. Now, the expectation would be that all of the states in Australia would gain because they're all getting more tourists. Not so. What we found was that Queensland, which is Australia's most tourism-oriented state and a host destination to over 20% of Australia's international visitor nights, is a net loser from an across-the-board expansion of international tourism. And indeed, so too were Tasmania and Western Australia. I find that an extraordinary result. And the reason is that these states are heavy exporters. And the additional tourism that's coming into Australia, with the upward pressure on the exchange rate, then affected our export industries and import competing industries. And so there was a loss of the traditional exports within those states. I ask, does Quebec have similar implications? I don't know, but I think that would be an interesting study that could be done. Industry gainers and losers from the same study: service industries catering directly to international tourist gain, industries indirectly supplying tourism-related activities such as aircraft, maintenance, construction and so on, they gained, but the losing industries were the non-tourism exporters, that is, those export industries that are not in tourism, agriculture, mining, and so on, and also import competing industries lost, because with the higher value of the dollar, that meant that imports were cheaper relatively, and so those sectors that were competing against the imports were losing. So the point is, and this is the point I'm making, that there are gainers and losers, and it's overly simplistic simply to say that an increase in tourism will lead to an across-the-board increase in all good things. Another example, the London Olympics. A study was done prior to the London Olympics looking at the effects, and the simulations showed that there would be a positive effect on the UK as a result of the London Olympics. There would be an increase in GDP over the years of almost £2 billion and so on. However, there will be a loss of GDP and employment in areas outside London. London was the gainer and the home counties, but outside London and the home counties, there would be losses of GDP and employment. See, it's just gainers and losers again. Reasons included the spending in London by UK residents from outside London visiting the Games, movement of workers into London, and of course the lottery, which everyone wanted to become millionaires, parting with their money, buying lottery tickets and so on to support the Games. That also was a leakage of money out of the local economies. The impact of the game varied significantly across different sectors of the UK. Sectors expanding included construction, passenger land transport, business services, hotels and restaurants, just as we'd expect. However, the simulations showed that certain other sectors contract in size: manufacturing, agriculture, fishing and other services. Now, while no sectors actually contracted, the modelling was against the base case scenarios of growth and showed that these sectors expanded less than they otherwise would have because of the Games. So, and overall, the effect of the Olympic Games on the UK economy was projected to be 0.066% on the national GDP. What this tells us is that while many destination authorities all around the world are putting a lot of emphasis on event tourism and seeing events as cash cows for the economy, things are not that simple. Tourism-related industries can gain from the events, but other industries might lose from the events. And just be careful when you hear the next minister talking about all the great benefits you're going to get from an event. Be sceptical, because I do believe that there needs to be much more state-of-the-art analysis of events than has occurred internationally over the years. And the final thing I just mentioned, again, I've mentioned yield measures a couple of times. Our team has developed CG measures of yield where we've looked at the bottom line. What is the bottom line of a tourist contribution to the economy after allowing for all of these interactive effects? And again, real value added per visitor night, it comes down to 12.13. You might remember it was up above 90 as an average amount of money that is expenditure from a representative tourist. Now we find, when we've done the modelling and we've looked at the actual contribution to the economy, that the average contribution is just $12.13, and that enabled us to determine those origins that contributed above average and those that contributed less. And we did the same sorts of displays again, and we found that only in 2 cases, China and the UK, were they above the average in both contribution to gross value added per visitor night and average length of stay. Now, these figures change. There will be now, with trends taking place in the world, and we need to do it for other economies as well. But nevertheless, it's much more revealing, we think, to use these CG models, because it gives us the bottom line after all industry interactive effects have taken place. Have I got just 5 minutes? Thank you. Sorry, is that? Okay, sorry. And that's for gross operating surplus. Okay. Will the tourists keep coming? There's all sorts of changes taking place in the world, And what I was going to do, I may not be able to do it now, was to say how important investment was. And in Australia recently, we had a bit of a think tank to determine what were some of the serious investment issues facing tourism in Australia. There's an underinvestment in Australian tourism, and there's low rates of return, there's lack of data, there's cautious investors, there's the cyclical nature of tourism, and there's complexities dealing with multi-levels of government and approvals processes, and a lack of coherent vision and direction by governments. And what were the solutions to this? Well, we think that there should be more emphasis on increasing industry productivity and a more highly skilled workforce. We see implications for education here. Tourism industry needs to shift from a cost leadership strategy, which it has, to one of product differentiation. More data mining, research analysis, market data, emphasis on transport access, and again, to understand the influence of different governments in determining whether investment takes place or not. And so, I'll conclude. Look, the final issue I was going to talk about was a technique called cost-benefit analysis, which goes beyond impact analysis to determine the full costs and full benefits of particular actions. And my view is that there's not enough of this in tourism, and that investment projects that are large need to be subjected to cost-benefit analysis. And in Australia now, certainly with events, large events, we are going in the direction of doing cost-benefit analysis for these events. So with that, I think I've got the last thing, and yes, that's too much. The upshot, look, I'll finish the upshot. Each of these approaches are important to policy. Expenditure measures are of limited yield. TSA measures the direct contribution of tourism, but not the indirect contribution. Estimates of economic impacts require an economic model. CG models represent state-of-the-art approach to estimating economic impacts. And however, economic impacts do not have policy significance that they're thought to have, and if we're serious about resource allocation, we need to do cost-benefit analysis.
Wow. There's a lot, it reminds us that there's a lot to consider when we do our analysis. Je pense que tous les concepts possibles et impossibles ont été présentés et on voit bien qu'on a vu l'utilité de chacun d'entre eux, puis on a vu aussi leurs limites et comment il faut avoir vraiment, avec des outils d'analyse, une analyse vraiment très sophistiquée, très fine, très pointue des retombées économiques. So, thanks a lot, sir. Really appreciate it. Sorry, but as a timekeeper, I have to do a bad job. No, stay here, please, because there should be some question. Au tout début, je vous ai parlé de deux façons des questions. Par papier. Le seul problème, c'est que j'aurais dû vous dire qu'il y a deux personnes qui se seraient promenées dans la salle et qui auraient ramassé vos bouts de papier avec vos questions. Ce n'a pas été fait. Alors, il y en a, par contre, qui ont communiqué par Twitter au panel éditorial et qui se sont rendus. Mais dorénavant, il y a Catherine et il y a Précia qui seront aux autres ateliers. Ils sont là dans les rangées. Elles sont là dans les rangées et qui ramasseront ces papiers-là très utiles pour la suite des choses. Alors, sans se perdre dans trop d'explications, je laisse la parole aux gens du panel avec une première question qui pourrait peut-être permettre de combler ce qui n'a pas pu être dit. Oui? Go ahead, sir.
Professor Dwyer, Stephen Smith from the University of Waterloo, way here in the back. thank you very much for a stimulating presentation. Because of time, I'm going to kind of crunch a number of questions together. There's a lot of interest from our audience here, and a lot of questions had come in. We'll present it as a choice. If you could recommend one course of action to Quebec, satellite account, a regional or provincial satellite account, versus a CGE model, which one would you recommend? And if it's the satellite account, should that be developed bottom up from Quebec data, or should it be developed top down from sort of national data allocated down to Quebec?
Right. With respect to the CG model versus the tourism satellite account, if one had unlimited resources, you'd do both, of course. But my view is that since the tourism satellite account is a core element of a CG model, then I believe that you develop the tourism satellite account and then develop a CG model based on that, because in Australia the states have faced the same dilemma, and our view is that the tourism satellite account only gives certain limited information and a snapshot at a particular time, so you're always looking backwards, Steve, whereas with the CG model, you can then use it for policy analysis. What if there were more Japanese visitors come? What if there were less from the USA? What if we got more visitors from France, etc., etc.? So I would develop the tourism satellite account first, but then a CG model, using that as a core, should be developed after that. The other question about top-down versus bottom-up approaches to development of regional satellite accounts, our team used a hybrid where we used elements of both, because we had to get data where we could, and we found that if we just were focused on one type of approach, then it didn't give us the information we wanted. So we used a hybrid approach, Stephen.
Thank you very much. One of our audience members has another question. And I think you've touched on this generally, but I'd like you to elaborate. Are we putting too much emphasis on measuring economic impact of tourism when we should talk more about cost and benefits analysis? And what are the implications for the authorities to work toward a cost-benefit analysis approach?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Our team has attempted to develop or go beyond economic measures of yield to attempt to develop what we call sustainability measures of yield, where we had environmental and social values together with economic values. The problem was that you couldn't come up with just an index that enabled us to be able to incorporate social impacts and environmental impacts and economic impacts meaningfully. Nevertheless, if one has sustainability as a goal, then I believe that one should always be attempting to at least look at the trade-offs between the economic effects and the social and environmental effects, and often they don't work in the same ways. For example, our team developed some measures of environmental effects and put them together with the economic effects. And what did we find? We found that if a destination is wanting both high-yield tourists economically and environmentally friendly tourists, you can't have both. Why not? Because if you target the tourists that have high economic yield, that spend more, inevitably the people who spend more will have a higher carbon footprint. And so there would be then worse environmental consequences. But the very asking of these questions, I think, is very important, and I agree with the sentiments of the questioner that I really am a firm believer that sustainability issues should be paramount here, not just one of the pillars of sustainability, which is economics.
Several of the audience members have, again, asked a similar question or expressed similar concerns, and that is, how do we generate greater attention and interest from politicians, from our elected officials, in looking at the importance of investing in tourism development. And I think an aspect of that, and this is one that I've heard personally from politicians that I deal with, you start talking about the economic importance of tourism, and the response you get is blah, 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 blah. I've heard that all the time for every other sector, every other industry. What makes tourism so different? How do you get them to pay attention? How do you get them to believe you?
Now that's a difficult one, Stephen. I think obviously the more credible are the statistics about the importance of tourism, then the more people will be confident about their ability to invest in full awareness and knowledge of what the possibilities are. But the fact is, investment is, well, there's two types of investment. Obviously, there's a public sector investment, which is very important to as facilitating infrastructure, which then within which tourism can develop. But the important element here also is the investment from the private sector. And unfortunately, the private sector's had so many kicks in the knees in recent years that they've become very cautious, and they see tourism investment as high risk and speculative. In Australia, the major financial institutions are very cautious about supporting tourism investment, and for good economic reasons. So it's not it's a hard row to hoe, I think, to increase investment. But we who have studied it know that it's absolutely crucial that investment be undertaken, but there's no magic formula to force people to invest, unfortunately.
Any other questions?
I don't think there's any more questions, Larry. You can
Thanks, Steve.
relax and take it easy for the afternoon and enjoy the other speakers now for a change.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.